Love it or hate it, Double Dragon 3 The Rosetta Stone was at the time in 1990 the third and final game in the famous arcade beat-em-up series that once defined the genre in a spectacular way. I must admit, when I think of Double Dragon 3, memories of playing the Nintendo Entertainment System version, which is of course completely different, was frustrating enough with its bizarre and new style of play as well as having just one life. We then take a look at the arcade game itself, which is again very different to the first two games. The major difference here is the graphical style, of course. It's not quite digitized sprites, but kind of seems like the developers were attempting to add that realistic look to the game, which in reality looks a little strange. As sprites move, they do look very wooden, admittedly. We have the basic combat moves here, including flying kicks, punches, and running, and it is very different to control and play compared to the other two arcade games at this point in the series. This version also featured an option to play as different characters as opposed to just Billy or Jimmy. Technos developed the first two games, and this game was actually contracted to another development team entirely, which was handed to East Technology, who had developed a few games prior to this. They actually developed several games for Taito, and as for Technos, this was the only game that East Technology developed for them. Could it be that this new development team made fans of the Double Dragon franchise divided in opinions, so much so that trusting them with developing another game was totally forbidden? Who knows? I am sure that somebody out there has a story to tell about potential internal issues. But what we do know is that people weren't impressed with its original microtransactions, where we could put more coins in order to buy weapons and upgrades inside the shops throughout this game. A very early attempt then at what the world later on in life would be dominated with, although in 1990 this was complete shock horror at most. Regardless, just like any popular franchise of the 80s, sequels came in their hordes and Double Dragon would be no exception. So, today we are going to painfully rank from worst to best the best possible home port of 1990s arcade game Double Dragon 3 The Rosetta Stone. Now, brace yourselves, this is going to be some painful viewing. Very possible Double Dragon 3 for the Amstrad CPC, releasing way back in 1991 by the sales curve, is highly likely one of the slowest, if not the slowest, beat-em-ups around. I have covered some horrendous Amstrad arcade ports in this series, but I am pretty confident that at this point in the series, then this is actually the very worst out of all of them. There are so many things wrong with the Amstrad game, it's going to take me a few hours getting through it all, so brace yourselves. Okay, so firstly, as you can see, this game runs incredibly slow, like really slow. At times we see an arrow sign on the right hand side center which says go. Even if we do choose to go, it stays there and doesn't seem to register that we are in fact moving to where it's telling us to go. It's almost like it is so slow that even an Amstrad computer is laughing at it all. Secondly, playing a fighting game with sprites of all the same colour is very confusing, especially when you are crowded around with baddies hitting and kicking you. It's very easy to wonder which one you are, and by having such a slow pace of movement, this makes it even more confusing to know who you are at times. It goes without saying we don't have music here either, just rudimentary sound effects. I get to the end of the first part of stage 1 when all of a sudden enemy sprites are jumping down from above. In the arcades game they actually emerge from the door, but here it's almost like even the enemy sprites had had enough of this game and simply wanted to end it all by jumping off from the top of the building. One of the most irritating things above all is how quickly the timer quickly ticks down as it watches down at you and laughs at you how slow the pace of the game is going at. It truly is a dull and pitiful game that should never have been unleashed on poor innocent kids back then. I honestly feel gutted for anybody who ended up with this version. The only feature I can say that has going for it is when entering shops. It does manage to perform at a good speed at this point. Dear God, I actually thought that the Commodore 64 version would be better than the other versions so far. I was very wrong though. Sure, it looks better, well, the backgrounds at least. The sprites here are just a pixelated mess, which don't even look like good pixelated mess either. The game actually starts off promising with a fairly good SID tune play for the game's introduction, as well as giving the player the storyline too, which is even animated. The game then began and my hopes were suddenly squashed. There appears to be no effort whatsoever of even making the sprites in this version walk or move like the arcade game. Here they just move like an average beat 'em up game. Nothing really makes this version stand out like the arcades game did. We have no in-game music, which I was a little bit baffled with. Truth be told, the sound effects here used are pretty god-awful for a 1991 release for the C64 by the sales curve. Now, the real baffling thing is that the sales curve actually produced some really awesome top-quality games before 1991 and during 1991, such as Rodland in 1991, Silkworm in 1989, and Saint Dragon in 1990. I just don't understand how this game could be so bad. As I was saying, the sprites move around fairly quickly, but with this also comes a weightless look about them, especially performing flying kicks. The good thing, I suppose, of this version is how at least it is a hell of a lot quicker to get to end of stages before the timer runs out. Hit collision detection isn't too bad at times, but it just doesn't feel like you're punching and kicking enemies. It just feels flat and almost lifeless. Oddly enough, I went into the shop to test how that looked in the C64 version, and was greeted with a young lady who looked very different to the lady in the arcade game. There have been a lot worse in all fairness to this game. Check out the original 2 Commodore 64 releases for the original Double Dragon game, which I've also covered in this series. Those 2 versions of Double Dragon makes this game look like the best thing since sliced bread. There is parts of the game which is missing, things such as the conveyor belt as we are fighting the first boss, and also the car which we normally see during the main part of stage 1 is actually missing here. Possibly one of the only games around where enemies will constantly choose to jump around so much. This is Acclaim's 1992 release for the Nintendo Game Boy. Baffling, and it's obvious to say that the other games of Double Dragon for this platform are just fine. Then we have this version, actually taking away the Rosetta Stone in its title, replacing it with Double Dragon 3, the arcade game. Most noticeably with this version is the music. It's very different from how it should be if it's claiming to be the arcade game, that is, and I must say that this choice of music is very irritating to listen to after just a few minutes of playing. It's a fairly tough game too, and what makes it even more tough is having enemies who constantly jump around everywhere. It's also kind of difficult to see where you are in this version at times. Some monochrome games can get away with doing this, but not this game. Is it a good game then for the Game Boy? Well, not particularly. I'll personally stick with the original Double Dragon games for this platform. This Game Boy game isn't really the best version to pull off special moves either compared to other platforms versions of it. Now, you might call me insane, but yeah, yes I did just put the ZX Spectrum 128KB version over C64 and Game Boy versions, and rightly so too. Now, let me explain. Sure, the C64 game had colours, but with that came sprites that moved around so very quickly and just seemed a fairly bit boring to play. So, the ZX Spectrum isn't attempting to give us that strange movement or rather that realistic look either here, but at least it is slowed down and at a pace where it's kind of enjoyable to play to an extent. Controlling Billy is flawless here, and pulling off attacks just seem less fussy than the previous versions. I will say though that although I felt this was better, it was a tad on the easy side in comparison to the other 8-bit versions. I mean, generally we need to hit an enemy a few times before they fall down. But here, one hit and they are down. If you can ignore the fact that this is a monochrome game, this is a fairly good play, and kind of reminded me of the pace of something like Target Renegade. We have no music here either, and some sound effects which are okay but nothing particularly special. One thing that I did enjoy most of all with this version is that the easiness of hitting down incoming motorbikes. The other version so far was just pure hell with flying kicking them off to stop them, but here my moves worked first time and they were kissing the floor before you knew it. Hit collision detection is very impressive here too. There wasn't a particular time that I noticed where a hit didn't actually register an enemy. The shops also seem to function very well. Really, I honestly thought this version would be not much better than the Amstrad's poor attempts at this game, but I was very wrong. Although it's not the best ZX Spectrum game of all time, in the context of this video it actually isn't too bad, all things considered. Again, this one released in 1991. Although this IBM PC release looks the part, I will tell you now, this version is incredibly challenging to play. It is going for that wooden look like the arcades game had in terms of movement, that look of realism that is, but it isn't particularly great to control. The strange thing is with this DOS game is that, just like any other DOS game from this era, we have an option to choose our sound card before the game begins. I chose the best option using DOSBox, and sure enough the intro music sounds spectacular. Problem is that the game doesn't feature any in-game music itself, which is a major wasted opportunity for this release by Storm back in '92. The next couple of versions in this video are visually similar to this, but plays a hell of a lot better than this version. Surprisingly, the Atari ST had a very good conversion of Double Dragon 3. Although this is a very speedy version, as you'll witness from the gameplay in the video, I don't think I've ever seen Billy move around so fast, in any other Double Dragon game that is. Now, the Atari ST pushes the slower versions away what we've seen so far, and takes on that Commodore 64 approach by the seams of things. My initial thoughts were, nah, this emulator is set up wrong, but no, this is the speed this version originally ran at, and that shocked me, for normally I complain of Atari ST games suffering from very slow frame rates. So as you can see, of course this version is going to look nicer than the 8-bit conversions undoubtedly, but really it's down to the gameplay, and I kind of proved that with the ZX Spectrum version. Although that version was only monochrome, then damn, it played better than a C64 game in my opinion. It takes a little getting used to compared to the slower versions, but it really isn't a bad Atari ST beat 'em up at all. I will say that it is on the slightly tougher side of versions, but it controls well enough, and those baddies in this version seriously mean business. Hit collisions are detected really well here. No music, which is a shame because I particularly love the arcade's opening level tune, but we might get there eventually in this video. The only major issue I have with this version is its speed of sprites. Now, you could argue that we get through levels quicker this way, but sometimes we need a little precision to attack. Having enemies moving around so quickly is no easy task here. Again, it's just another version where there hasn't really been an attempt to give the game that realism in how characters move around on screen. Its duller colours actually works fairly well, as the arcade game itself wasn't particularly bright and colourful. This was another Cells Code release, in which it also released in '91. I'd happily say that this was one of the better games for this platform. Now, I would likely say that the Commodore Amiga's version was a little better than the Atari ST's offering. Sure, both pretty much look identical, but the speeds which we had in the ST's version wasn't a factor with this version, and in terms of speed, I mean. This Amiga version gave us a much more playable speed, in that it's just perfect. Not too slow and not too fast, and it plays a little better for it too for that reason. Where I was failing of lining up enemies to get some precise kicks with the ST's version, version where sprites were moving around so quickly, but here this version gave us a little bit more time in order to kick somebody's head in. Sadly, again, just like every other version so far, apart from the Game Boy's release, the Amiga version had no music whatsoever, but I can say that at this point the sound effects here are the very best. The sounds of punches really sounds like we are punching. It's got that bassy sound to it. Really though, graphically and visually, this is almost identical to the ST in the DOS game, if not a slight bit brighter. Again, just like the lack of music each version has failed with so far, this version is also going for the I don't give a toss how the arcade game moved, and it kind of works and plays better than the original arcade game in that respect too. Hit collisions are pretty much spot on here, and yeah, like I've said, it's got that higher ranking to the ST's game for the simple fact that this had better and more manageable speed to sprites, as well as sound effects which truly packs a punch here. Although this isn't the best Sega Mega Drive beat-em-up games of all time, I'd say that for every version of Double Dragon 3 that was ever released, this is probably the best version to play apart from the Game Boy release. It is also the only version to feature music whilst we're playing the game too, which sounds pretty incredible for this Mega Drive release. We also get sound effects here which certainly sound good too. It's much more of a substantial game than the Amiga version, where our sprites look bigger and just seem much more sturdy too. We also get separate facial sprite designs when punching enemies, and it looks pretty good. Of course, this is a fairly tough game like several others in this video, but in good old Sega Mega Drive fashion, we do have an options menu to increase the number of coins we can use within the game. But in terms of difficulty, we actually have no difficulty settings within the Mega Drive release, just a standard difficulty level. Flying Edge released this port in 1993. It was also developed by Software Creations, which is why we have a completely different look compared to most other versions in this video. The Sega Mega Drive version is also one of the only versions which we can run and dive into our enemies. This has always been achieved by quickly tapping left or right followed by an action button. I tried this on most other versions in this video and it never worked. Playing as other characters in this version was also good too. It kind of felt like each one of the other characters, when not playing as Billy, offered something a little different in terms of special moves. I actually took advantage of playing as other characters in this release, as other versions did offer this but didn't really do much, and to be fair, I prefer playing Double Dragon as it was intended with either Billy or Jimmy. So that's it for ranking every release of Double Dragon 3 today, and just remember, somebody will likely say it, I didn't include the NES version because the NES version was a different game altogether. So as always, which version was you very disappointed with, and do you necessarily agree with my picks in this list? Drop a comment below, and until next video comes, thanks for watching.